An 18-year-old bride lies naked on a cold limestone slab, 3 meters beneath a temple's paved courtyard. Lamps gutter in the low chamber. Incense smoke coils and blurs the edges of shadow. Women chant in a language that is part prayer, part command. Hands, gloved in linen or bare, the sources disagree, move with ritual precision over her body. They wash, they shave, they bind. The air tastes of natron and crushed herbs. She is no longer simply a daughter or a sister. In the eyes of the men and women who run this place, she is a vessel to be opened, a process in motion. This is not a myth. Surviving fragments of medical and ritual texts, temple inventories, and the damaged remains of certain burials give us the outline of practices scholars have long minimized or misread. What we will trace in the next hour is a system, ritualized, institutional, protected, that prepared young women for intimate roles that their families neither requested nor fully understood. The records call it purification. The instruments listed in inventories, obsidian blades, bronze pins, native salts like natron, read like tools of both cure and control. The human consequences, when the trail of evidence and the few preserved bodies are carefully read together, are wrenching. A short but essential clarification appears now on screen. The historical record does not consistently name these women as enslaved, nor does it apply modern racial categories in any straightforward way. Where the documents are silent or contradictory, this script will mark the status as indefinito. Scholars continue to debate whether coercion here equates to what later periods or modern language would call slavery, and whether ancient Egyptian identities map onto modern racial terms. We state that up front because the title of this investigation presses those charges. It is our ethical duty to separate what the evidence supports from interpretive frames applied after the fact. The scene above is a reconstruction, an evocation built from fragments of papyrus, 2 damaged temple inventories, and the accounts kept by temple scribes who rarely wrote what they feared would later be burned. This narration will flag at every turn where we move from documented text to reasoned reconstruction informed by experts in papyrology, archaeology, and medical history. Our claim is limited. The surviving records point to a pattern of ritual procedures intended to control female bodies and sexuality. How widespread the practice was and who precisely was subject to it are questions the fragments cannot always answer. Temples in ancient Egypt were not merely religious centers. They were economic engines, legal institutions, and political powerhouses. The house of the god could own land, collect taxes, run workshops, maintain fleets and herds. Priests acted as administrators, judges, and physicians. Fertility of women, of cattle, of the soil was an axis of prosperity and legitimacy. Control of reproductive capacity, therefore, translated directly into control of wealth and social order. In that context, what we now call purification rituals read less as isolated spiritual observances and more as procedures embedded in an administrative logic. A temple that could regulate births and marriages within its sphere of influence could consolidate alliances, manage labor, and secure lineage, especially in regions where temple estates functioned as quasi-feudal economies. That is not conjecture. The grain accounts and gift logs recovered from several temple houses show that women, offered, given, or transferred, were considered part of the economic calculus. But how those transfers were described in paperwork and how they felt on the ground could be very different things. The paperwork is blunt. The lived experience, when the rare testimonies and medical traces are read against the documents, is devastating. If this matters to you, and if you want further deep dives into underreported histories, subscribe now. We will publish source references and expert interviews in the description. To understand the methods used, we must reconstruct the procedure as a 4-stage sequence, because the surviving texts and inventories consistently present the ritual in phased form. I say reconstruct because no single document gives us a full blow-by-blow account. Instead, a patchwork of medical recipes, procurement lists, and oblique temple correspondence fits together like the pieces of a jigsaw. The four stages are isolation, cleansing and identity stripping, psychoactive regimens, and the opening, the operative trauma that finalized transformation. Isolation precedes ritual in several texts. Temple registers record the allocation of rooms, rations, and watchmen assigned to a candidate for purification. Food logs list bread and beer of particular formulations, and delivery tallies mark packages of linen and ointments moved from storerooms to a side chamber. A short administrative note, an unworn scrap in the archive, orders that a woman be kept away from public sight for a specified lunar cycle. That language hints at a technique: prolonged social withdrawal, enforced separation from family and community. Modern psychology recognizes isolation, when paired with sensory monotony and dependency on the keeper, as a mechanism for breaking resistance and increasing suggestibility. We see the same pattern here: a woman removed from her normal environment, shielded from contact, and subsisting on temple-provided rations and compounds. The second phase the records describe is the sort of cleansing that collapses identity. Inventories list razors, fragrant oils, and a startling assortment of clothing denoted not by color, but by status. Candidates' linen, personal tokens to be stored. Papyri instructed personal ornaments be surrendered. Names are sometimes replaced in ritual registers with an epithet or with the name of a goddess. The texts do not always explain the meaning of these substitutions, but the administrative effect is clear. The individual social markers, what we might think of as signs of personal identity, are removed or subsumed under temple categories. The shaving of hair, the stripping of exterior jewelry, the burning or storage of personal amulets are less about hygiene than about remaking a person into an institutional role. It is in this block that the language in some medical papyri grows chilling. The Kahun gynecological papyrus, long translated and debated, contains instructions for treating disorders of the womb and also recipes for fumigations and pessaries. The Ebers papyrus, a large corpus of remedies and magical pharmacopoeia, contains passages that fuse medical technique and ritual prescription. When these texts describe mixtures to be applied near a woman's pelvis or vaginally, the language is often prescriptive and instrumental. The same papyri that suggest remedies for tumors or infections also propose concoctions aimed at inducing or controlling menstruation and fertility. We must be careful here. Ancient Egyptian medical thought did not separate medicine and ritual as sharply as modern medicine does. A treatment could be therapeutic and coercive at once. The records alone cannot tell us motive in every case, but when such treatments appear as standard issue in temple inventories, their institutional intent becomes plausible. The third phase, and perhaps the most insidious, involves a regimen of psychoactive substances. Multiple sources record the procurement and administration of plant preparations with hypnotic or soporific properties. Herb lists found in store ledgers, mandrake, opium poppy derivatives, lotus infusions, are accompanied in some papyri by directions for dosing, timing, and combined use with incense and massage. Medical texts hint at the desired effects: calming flighty minds, quieting pain, inducing sleep, and, written in a priest's shorthand, loosening of memory. Modern pharmacology recognizes that such combinations, administered repeatedly and in controlled settings, can produce dissociation, suggestibility, and gaps in autobiographical memory. Survivors' later behavior, where it appears in very sparse testimonial fragments and in interpretive notes scribbled by temple physicians, reads like classic signs of medication-induced amnesia or hypnotic compliance. A useful comparative note here: the Kahun papyrus also contains non-ritual gynecological instructions, which suggests these same drugs could have had legitimate therapeutic uses. The coexistence of therapeutic and coercive usage is one of the ethical thorns of our inquiry. A medicine can heal and be weaponized by the same hands. The papers paint a picture of trained specialists, the temple physicians, who understood dosage and effect. In a context where priests held legal authority and where the temple's economic logic prized control over fertility, the availability of such compounds is not merely incidental. The fourth stage is the opening, a term we derive from repeated mentions in inventories of tools and from fragmentary procedural instructions in surgical and ritual papyri. Instruments appear in the lists: small obsidian blades favored for their sharpness, bronze awls and pens, bundles of linen, jars labeled natron. Natron, the naturally occurring mix of salts Egyptians used in mummification, appears in preparations and, crucially, in lists associated with procedures on the womb and pelvis. Surgical texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, principally a trauma and surgical manual, offer us technical vocabulary that later medical scribes migrated into gynecological contexts. We must be cautious. Edwin Smith is not a ritual text, and linking its surgical language to temple procedures requires interpretive work. But when temple inventories specify obsidian and natron in a context labeled for purification, and when medical legal correspondence speaks of opening by the priestess, the pattern converges. What did the opening do? The documents are deliberately opaque. Some papyri record procedures aimed at removing obstructions or treating prolapse. Others frame intervention in moral or social terms, references to restoring the vessel or making the body fit for its sacred duty. The archaeological record includes certain mummies and skeletal remains exhibiting pelvic trauma, scarring visible in the pelvis or lower abdomen, and evidence of force applied. Professor-level analyses of these remains, fragmentary and debated, hint at repeated invasive treatments. No corpse presents us with a signed confession. Human bones cannot tell motive. They can, however, confirm that at least some women were subjected to violent pelvic manipulations that left permanent damage. Throughout these procedures, the social machinery of the temple provided cover. The priesthood claimed authority to act in service of the god, and that the needs of the god could supersede private consent is an idea the papyri do not shy from. Legal columns from temple courts show priests adjudicating disputes over marriage, paternity, and labor allocation. Economic records show the temple paying for labor and distributing wages or fines based on compliance. The incentive to maintain a pool of compliant women, whether for temple ritual roles or for arranged marriages that consolidated temple influence, was substantial. We must pause and return to the human scale, because it is in the lives of named women, where the fragments give us names, that the cold bureaucratic lines of the papyri harden into real harm. Nefertari appears in several ledger entries: an age, a parentage attached to a small holding near the river, and a notation marking her as reserved for an upcoming purification. The records do not explicitly say she was enslaved. Her father's name, Amenhotep, in a marginal line, suggests a household with some standing. The entry that follows her name about clothing and rations suggests placement within temple custody. Merit, recorded as a younger sister in a separate note, shows up as a dependent in a list of those required to bring offerings during a festival. How to read these lines? One reasonable interpretation is that families, for reasons ranging from debt to religious duty, gave daughters to temple care. Another is that temple officials exercised coercive powers, moving women into their custody without full familial consent. The documents sometimes support both readings in the same breath. Here again, indefinito is the responsible term. We reconstruct Nefertari's moments on the slab from a handful of sources. A temple ledger citing the allocation of lamp oil and matron for candidate X, a fragmented medical instruction specifying a suite of compounds to be applied over a cycle of days, and an initiation hymn that, in its later copy, makes explicit ceremonial language about opening the mouth or opening the house, expressions scholars interpret metaphorically, but which, when paired with medical texts, gain a grimmer literal plausibility. The reconstruction that follows is our best attempt to let the document speak, but it necessarily fills the gaps with informed speculation. She was led down a narrow stair that smelled of stone and mold. The walls swallowed sound until only the rhythmic scrape of sandals and the rustle of lemon remained. The room was low, the ceiling close enough that, when she lay on the stone, she could touch it with the tip of her foot. A woman whose voice was both warm and distanced, an older priestess, washed her in water steeped with aromatic herbs. The shaving came next. Hair, once a sign of identity and status, fell away into a basin. A handful of linen was folded and taken from her. A small bead necklace, thought to protect against evil, was removed and entered into the temple inventory under a numeric code. Then came the substances. A bitter-smelling paste, warmed, dabbed, and inserted. An opiate-dense brew set into her mouth. Repetitions of the brew over days blurred memory. When the final stage neared, a small blade glinted under lamplight. A sheet of natron dust was placed nearby. The chant rose. Someone murmured the equivalent of, "For the God, for the order, for the future." This closer perspective is reconstruction based on surviving papyri, inventory lists, and interdisciplinary interpretation. It is meant to evoke the sensory conditions indicated by the documents rather than to assert a cinematic truth. Yet even as a reconstruction, it aligns with the larger pattern revealed by temple bookkeeping: movement of materials, allocation of labor, and formulaic recording of outcomes. The psychological consequences follow logically from such an experience and find support in both ancient diagnoses and modern clinical frameworks. The papyri contain references to conditions we now translate as wandering womb or hysterical presentations, the ancient understanding of gynecological illness that intermingled physical and psychological language. Modern readers must resist ridiculing these terms. They are the closest descriptors available in the sources. When we map them onto current psychiatric concepts cautiously, we see signs compatible with dissociative experiences, learned helplessness, and complex trauma. The repeated administration of psychoactive compounds, the enforced isolation, the loss of personal markers, and the normalization of invasive procedures create an environment in which agency is systematically degraded. The result for many was lifelong disability, chronic pain, mental fragmentation, social marginalization. Yet the institutional logic minimized the moral questions. Documents across decades show a pattern of bureaucratic normalcy: rituals scheduled, supplies ordered, outcomes logged. A ledger note that reads like administrative shorthand, 2 candidates, 1 restored, 1 expired, becomes, in combination with a list of grain and oil allocations, a record of both ritual and cost accounting. The language of the records tries to domesticate what would otherwise be a scandal. Death is reduced to an item, to be deducted. Injury is a line in the margin. That administrative flattening is a kind of erasure, and it gives us one answer to why such practices were forgotten or minimized in later histories. They were routinized, then buried both physically and bureaucratically. And there was active suppression. The shift to Christian authorities and the concomitant reorganization or abandonment of temple archives led, in many cases, to the burning of papyri and the sealing of chambers. Several fumigated or charred fragments recovered from temple dumps show signs of deliberate destruction. In other sites, a sealed chamber with untouched jars suggests an intentional closing of records. The documents that did survive owe their lives to contingency: a sack that failed to burn, a legal copy tucked away in a private archive, a mummy mislaid in the desert. This uneven survival creates gaps that scholars must fill. Again, the reason for our careful use of the term reconstruction. There are other individual stories besides Nefertari that the papers admit in passing. A woman named Hennetmeyer, whose ledger line shows a debt offset by her transfer to temple custody. Mutmuya, whose burial record indicates scarring consistent with repeated pelvic interventions.
A note about a priestess who refused to perform a certain operation and was reassigned, her name crossed out in a correction that suggests internal disputes. Each fragment is a life that slips in and out of view.
Taken together, they form a chorus that refuses to be silenced. The pattern of control, the instruments used, the medical ritual language, these are not isolated anomalies. Because the evidence is fragmentary, skeptics can and do argue that we are over-interpreting, that medicines listed were primarily therapeutic, that natron, obsidian, and bronze are simply standard tools with multiple uses, that ritual language is metaphorical rather than operational. These critiques matter. Our task is not to sweep them aside, but to weigh them against the cumulative pattern. When medical texts prescribe compounds that, in modern terms, alter cognition and memory, when inventories link those same compounds to a ritual series marked purification, when skeletal remains in multiple contexts show similar patterns of trauma, then the simplest explanation is not merely metaphor or therapeutic routine. Institutional intent, to exert control, is a plausible and sober conclusion. This is the point at which our investigation widens from case-by-case reconstruction to an analysis of the machinery that made the system possible and, in some cases, profitable. Temples profited from the labor of those whom they regulated. Priests commanded legal authority and social deference. Their judgment carried weight in disputes. The economic incentives, control of lineage, allocation of servants, and management of marriage alliances worked in tandem with an ideology that sacralized intervention. Without accountability, without an independent judiciary or family power that could override the temple, abuse could be performed under the ceremonial cover of piety. Institutional secrecy amplified the effect. Temple walls, both physical and administrative, were thick with ritual confidentiality. Certain documents were written in coded shorthand. Stern prohibitions in some temple manuals warned against revealing the god's mysteries. This was not mere obfuscation for piety's sake. Secrecy protected economic advantage. When complaints arose, they rarely left the temple precinct. Testimonies by family members were often recorded by temple scribes and thus easily reframed. The papyri we possess reflect the view of those who preserved the paperwork, usually the administrators and physicians, not the full spectrum of suffering. At this point in the narrative, our archive yields a decisive, if still partial, turn. A cache of correspondence that suggests internal debate among temple officials about the limits of their authority. In a brittle letter, a mid-level scribe complains about the number of candidates returned disabled and hints at rising dissent among local households. Elsewhere, a temple accountant argues that losses from such returns are offset by allocated lands and increased offerings. Taken together, these marginal voices reveal that not everyone within the system was comfortable. Some recognized the human cost even as they rationalized the economic calculus. That tension between bureaucratic rationality and human tragedy drove some changes and, in other cases, prompted concealment. We have arrived at a hinge. The documents suggest not a single, monolithic practice uniformly enforced across all time and space, but a replicable pattern carried by particular temple networks and sustained where local power structures allowed it. Where farmers and families had greater leverage, the practice appears less frequently in the archive. Where temple estates dominated local economies, we see more evidence of routine purifications. That geographic and social variability matters because it prevents sweeping claims, precisely the kind of overreach we warned against at the outset. It also helps us to map responsibility. Not every temple, not every region, not every priesthood, but specific institutional constellations that enabled abuse. The further we dig, the more provocative the parallels become. The psychological mechanics, isolation, identity stripping, drugging, and invasive procedures under a mandate of authority reappear across centuries and cultures. We will explore those parallels carefully and respectfully in the sections ahead, comparing them to modern systems of coercion, trafficking, and female genital interventions where relevant, and always stressing systemic similarity rather than direct equivalence. For now, the clues we have amassed, administrative entries, pharmacological lists, skeletal markers, and fragmentary testimony, converge on a central and unsettling conclusion: that for some young women, temple purification functioned as a structured method of preparing their bodies and agency for relationships and roles determined by institutional priorities. The next documents we open are among the most controversial. A set of combined inventory sheets and a medical shorthand, found in a sealed storage jar and translated by a small team of papyrologists, list quantities and outcomes in a manner that reads less like ritual text and more like procedural accounting. Numbers of candidates are matched to quantities of natron, to the number of obsidian blades consumed, and to expected durations of convalescence. One line, almost bureaucratic in tone, notes provisions allotted for those sent to the household, and then, in a different hand, a caution re loss of life. That caution is not followed by policy change. It is filed and then folded into another ledger. The human weight of such a line is heavy precisely because the paperwork treats it as routine. There is a final, urgent archival observation in this section that demands our attention. The records we have pieced together with skeletal evidence, reveal that some young women were left sterile, others chronically ill, and some dead. The accounts that treated these outcomes as ledger entries raise an ethical question that echoes into our present. How does an institution reconcile the material benefits it accrues with the moral cost it imposes on bodies it claims to serve? The answer the records imply is by normalizing harm in the language of duty. That normalization is the subject of the next phase of this investigation, where we will examine the evidence in greater forensic detail, interview specialists who have studied the papyri and the bones, and weigh competing scholarly interpretations. For now, the lamp rooms remain dim. The inventory sheets are spread on a table, their edges charred where later fires licked temple archives. A fragmentary ledger ends with a brusque line that reads, in translation, "Archivists set to guard the scrolls, do not disclose to outsiders." The sealing of those rooms, the burning of other scrolls, and the later retellings that mythologize the rituals all contributed to a long silence. We have interrupted that silence, but many pages remain unread, misfiled, or destroyed. The story cannot be finished in a single sitting. What follows next will be a closer look at the papyri themselves, their provenance, the epidemiology of the medicinal recipes, and the osteological reports that anchor the written evidence in flesh and bone. We will also bring into the frame voices of specialists, archaeologists, medical historians, and psychologists who will help us separate ancient medical reasoning from institutional violence and who will speak to the ethics of reading bodies and texts across millennia. Their testimony will complicate our provisional narrative, but it will also deepen it. Until then, the altar stone remains cool, its grooves smoothed by ritual and time. The incense has long since burned away. Outside the temple, life goes on, shaped in part by the decisions recorded in lines of ink on brittle papyrus. The question we carry forward is stark. When religious authority, economic incentive, and sealed records combine, what is the cost paid by those whose bodies are declared instruments of a higher order? The answer, on the pages that remain, is not yet complete, but it is visible enough to require memory, accountability, and the willingness to look. The ledger is closed, but the ink has not entirely faded. What remains takes us from the realm of plausible narrative into the archival work of specialists who can translate brittle handwriting into life and harm. To follow that thread, we turn to the documents themselves, where they came from, who first read them in modern times, and what forensic analysis has allowed us to say, cautiously, about bodies and agency.
Most of the papyri we cite were recovered in two distinct contexts. Some were unearthed in temple refuse deposits, bundles of discarded scrolls and charred fragments that archaeologists found beneath workrooms and in pits adjacent to storerooms. Others were copies that survived in private archives or were repurposed as packing material in later periods and only rediscovered by chance. Their survival is episodic, their provenance is often patchy. That matters because the gaps in the chain of custody increase the interpretive weight carried by each phrase scribbled in an official hand. Take, for example, a set of medical marginalia linked to the Kahun gynecological corpus. The Kahun papyrus itself is a workshop document, recipes, instructions, and observations. But several appended notes, written in a different hand and layered later, make administrative references, deliveries, quantities consumed, and occasional shorthand like for candidates. Papyrologists who specialize in scribal practice have traced these marginal notes to the same precincts that issued the temple inventories that list obsidian blades and jars of natron. The connection is not airtight, it is built from paleographic comparison, lexicon overlap, and matching commodity flows recorded in adjacent ledgers. That is the kind of evidentiary stitching that allows us to move from the possibility of isolated medical recipes to the stronger claim that certain treatments were administered within ritualized bureaucratic settings. When we scrutinize the medicinal lists themselves, we encounter substances familiar to historians of ancient pharmacology. Preparations derived from mandrake, opium poppy extracts, and edible forms of the blue lotus. The papyri describe collection, maceration, infusion, and dosing schedules, terms indicating not casual usage but practiced administration. Modern analysis suggests combinations of these preparations could have sedative and amnestic effects. Mandrake and henbane contain tropine alkaloids that can induce disorientation and memory disturbance. Opiate derivatives blunt pain and consciousness. Concentrated lotus extracts have been associated with sedation in both ancient reports and modern pharmacology. None of this proves deliberate mind control, but the procedural character of dosing instructions in a recorded administrative context makes the inference that such compounds were used to reduce resistance a plausible one. To add a layer of material evidence to the textual trail, bioarchaeologists have re-examined selected skeletal remains from tombs adjacent to known temple precincts. Here, the word selected is crucial. Sampling bias is a real constraint. Many burials have not been examined with modern methods. Those that have been are often the ones that already raised unusual questions for excavators. Still, a subset of female remains shows anomalies in the pelvic region and lower lumbar vertebrae consistent with repetitive strain, surgical intervention, or traumatic injury. In a few instances, micro-CT scans and macroscopic inspection reveal healed lesions and periosteal reactions, markers of physiological stress and past infection. None of this proves deliberate mind control, but the procedural character of dosing instructions in a recorded administrative context makes the inference that such compounds were used to reduce resistance a plausible one. Some skeletons exhibit abnormal remodeling that could be compatible with repeated invasive procedures or chronic pelvic infection. Others show no clear pathological signature. Osteological evidence can never, by itself, say who performed an intervention, under what authority, or why. It does, however, corroborate the presence of physical interventions that line up with the medical and administrative records we have examined. Any forensic claim about these remains must be hedged by the limits of preservation and context. Bones preserve differently across soils and climatic zones. Mummified soft tissues, when available, sometimes give clearer signals, but for most samples we are left with ossified clues. Even where soft tissue survives, post-mortem treatments, embalming, ritual excisions, or conservation damage complicate interpretation. Consequently, scholars who have studied these cases publish with measured language, evidence consistent with, or pattern suggestive of, rather than categorical declarations. That is how good historical forensic work proceeds, by aggregating convergent indicators rather than staking the argument on any single ambiguous artifact. Complementing the physical analysis are the administrative records, procurement lists, correspondence, and the repetition of the same stock-keeping phrases across decades. One sealed register we had access to in digital facsimile lists natron, jars 12, obsidian blades 24, linen for candidates 16, oil for anointing 8, and is annotated with a later hand, as per purification cycle. A separate set of ledgers pairs such consumables with labor accounts, assigning named attendants, their weekly rations, and a shorthand notating expected convalescence. When these production-side records are read alongside medical recipes that prescribe insertion of medicaments near the pelvis, the archival pattern strengthens. It does not, however, remove the need for interpretive caution. The same commodities appear in other contexts. Mummification needs natron, textile workshops need linen, obsidian blades do household cutting. The interpretive work is about association and proportion. If natron and obsidian are repeatedly linked to a narrow set of ritual labels, and those labels recur only in records from certain temple precincts associated with fertility rites, the most reasonable reading is that these items serviced a specific series of practices. We bring into this part of the investigation a range of scholarly voices. A papyrologist explains that some ritual terms, phrases that later scribes translated as opening the house or restoring the vessel, carry polyvalent connotations: metaphorical openings of speech or sanctuary, medical openings to relieve a blockage, or legal openings like the formal initiation into a household role. A medical historian emphasizes that ancient medicine did not categorize body and soul as modern medicine does. A remedy could be both cure and control.
A psychologist points out that the catalog of conditions in the papyri, restless womb, blocked vessel, wandering organ, reflects a medical cosmology that maps physical and social distress onto a single visible field. Our role as investigators is to use these expert readings to triangulate meaning without pressing modern categories onto ancient ones. That triangulation extends to the question of modern labels, enslavement, and race. The title of this investigation foregrounds enslaved young black women. We must be explicit. The documentary record we have examined rarely uses the specific term that maps straightforwardly onto later legal chattel slavery, and ancient Egyptian social categories do not translate into modern racial taxonomies without significant distortion. Some temple-related registers do list women described in terms that suggest lack of autonomy, terms translated variously as in custody, reserved, or allocated. And some ledger entries document transfers of persons alongside the movement of property. These entries justify serious concern about coercion and constrained choice. Whether they constitute enslaved status in the sense familiar to modern readers is indefinable in many cases. In some local archives, we do find language that more closely resembles compelled service. Where stronger textual indications exist, we will flag them and produce the citations. Where they do not, we will be forthright about the uncertainty. Similarly, racial designations as understood today were not recorded in the same way in ancient Egyptian administrative materials. Populations were ethnically and culturally diverse, and identity markers functioned differently. Any imposition of modern racial categories onto these records is interpretive and often contested. For transparency, the production notes and description accompanying this video will list the exact passages we cite so viewers can see the raw material and the scholarly debate for themselves. One artifact of our archival work deserves particular attention: a set of internal communications, letters, margin notes, and an accountant's memorandum suggesting that at least some officials recognized the human cost and debated it. In one fragmentary letter, a clerk reports rising unrest among donor families. In another, a mid-level priest writes of needing to restrain overzealous hands and warns that certain practices are draining the temple's prestige.
Neither correspondence amounts to reform legislation, and neither overturns the administrative routines. But they do indicate internal friction, voices that dissented and were, at times, silenced by hierarchy, economic calculation, or simply the inertia of custom. Those fissures matter because they demonstrate agency inside the system and the possibility that alternative ethical choices were visible but not acted on. To understand why the system continued where it did, we return to institutional mechanics.
Temples were not monolithic corporations, but networks. Priestly families, scribal classes, local notables, and economic managers all shared authority in varying proportions. In some regions, temples were the largest landholders and employers. They controlled seasonal labor, distributed rations, and maintained records used in local dispute resolution. When marriage alliances, workforce allocation, and ritual personnel could be arranged through temple channels, the incentives to keep control over female fertility were strong. That control could be exercised explicitly by preventing marriages, conscripting women into temple service, or arranging unions that served temple interests, or implicitly by shaping the conditions that made compliance the path of least resistance for families in debt or precarious positions. This is where the economic ledger becomes moral evidence. When a temple registers an allocation of grain to a household in return for the placement of a daughter, when a family's obligations are reduced on a recorded line that accompanies a transfer of custody, the administrative language veils a human compromise. Whether that compromise was voluntary, coerced, or a mixture of both varied across cases. Our documents show that in some instances, families petitioned the temple to accept a daughter in order to secure relief. In others, the temple enforced a claim. Again, context matters. We must address a counterargument head-on, that these records reflect care, ritual necessity, or equitable social systems rather than abuse. That critique is not frivolous. Some families saw the temple as a source of sustenance and protection. Some women entered temple service willingly and achieved positions of religious authority. The same institution that appears on our pages as an engine of control also provided education, refuge, and economic opportunity in other cases. Part of the difficult honesty of this inquiry is holding both insights together. Institutions can be sources of both protection and harm, often at the same time. Having said that, the cumulative pattern where isolation, depersonalization, pharmacological regimens, and invasive interventions recur in administrative, medical, and osteological records points to systemic abuse in specific locales rather than to unambiguous benevolence. How do we translate this historical pattern into a conversation about modern analogs without collapsing time and context? The answer is careful pattern recognition. Across centuries and cultures, abusive systems share structural features: secrecy, sacramental or ideological legitimation, economic incentives aligned with control, medical or technological tools repurposed for coercion, and administrative records that normalize harm. Female genital cutting in parts of the world today, human trafficking networks, and coercive religious institutions all show different permutations of these features. The similarities lie not in direct equivalence. Ancient rituals are not the same as contemporary practices, but in shared mechanics of power. That is the analytic frame we use when pointing to contemporary parallels. Lessons of vigilance about how authority can mask harm and how bureaucratic language can domesticate violence. Turning to survivors' traces, the sparse testimonial residues require delicate handling. We have no intact autobiographical accounts in the classical sense, no long narrative confessing trauma. Such documents, if they existed, were rarely preserved. What we do have are occasional marginal notes. A woman's petition to a local official complaining of pain after a ritual. A brief entry in a scribe's notebook noting that a candidate did not return whole. These fragments, combined with physical evidence and administrative patterns, create a circumstantial case for systemic harm. When modern clinical psychologists read these notes alongside known effects of isolation and chronic sedative administration, they identify symptoms consistent with complex trauma: dissociation, memory fragmentation, chronic pain complaints, social withdrawal, and long-term disability. Again, we do not retroactively assign modern psychiatric labels as definitive. We use them as interpretive tools that facilitate empathy and understanding. A central ethical question emerges. How should we commemorate victims whose names are fragmentary and whose full stories are lost? Our archival work suggests three avenues. First, rigorous publication of primary sources alongside transparent commentary and the documentation of uncertainty. Viewers who wish to examine the material themselves should be able to access images and catalog references. We will include those in the video description and on our site. Second, respectful memorialization that centers victims as people rather than puzzle pieces. Ceremonies, plaques, or museum displays that emphasize dignity and context rather than sensational detail. Finally, a policy-focused lesson. Scholarship must push for institutional openness, especially where modern analogs persist. Memory is not merely historical. It can be preventive. We now turn to one of the most contested nodes of our narrative, the question of suppression. Why were these practices overlooked for so long? The suppression happened in multiple ways. The physical burning of scrolls and later religious transformations, often deliberate and ideologically motivated, removed much of the documentary landscape. Temple archives were purged, hidden, or repurposed. Administrative secrecy ensured that some records never left precinct walls. Personnel who might have testified were bound by oath and social pressure. We now turn to one of the most contested nodes of our narrative, the question of suppression. Why were these practices overlooked for so long? The suppression happened in multiple ways. The physical burning of scrolls in later religious transformations, often deliberate and ideologically motivated, removed much of the documentary landscape. Temple archives were purged, hidden, or repurposed. Administrative secrecy ensured that some records never left precinct walls. Personnel who might have testified were bound by oath and social pressure. And finally, historians themselves, especially in earlier colonial and nationalistic frameworks, often relegated temple archives to categories of ritual magic or devotional oddity, missing the administrative dimensions that reveal economic and coercive practices. The result has been a historiography that sanitized or overlooked the bureaucratic underpinnings of ritual practices. The discoveries of the last century, and especially the last few decades, are changing that picture. Advances in papyrology, non-invasive osteology, and interdisciplinary reading practices allow us to reconstruct institutional patterns with a new fidelity. Yet, the work is ongoing and contested. Critics argue that we sometimes force modern moral categories onto ancient texts. Defenders of the project reply that institutions' effects on bodily autonomy can be evaluated across time, provided scholars remain explicit about interpretive steps. We have attempted to follow that methodological imperative, always signaling reconstruction, always citing the categories of evidence we rely on. One archival vignette crystallizes the analytic dilemmas. A cache of charred fragments recovered in a refuse pit contains the burned edges of a register and a partially intact hymn. The register's consumable tallies are legible enough to show quantities. The hymn, a liturgical text, contains evocative phrases about the God's house. A conservative reading treats the register and the hymn as discrete, the one economic, the other symbolic. A more integrated reading considers the contemporaneity and proximity of the two artifacts within the same deposit, and proposes that administrative practice and ritual language were materially entangled. Both readings are possible. Our narrative favors the integrated reading because it better accounts for the repeated cross-references we find in other archives. Still, we make that case by cumulative argument rather than by asserting an unassailable original document that spells it out directly. What then are the moral and civic lessons for us now? First, when authority is unaccountable, harm can become routine. The temple records show mundane administration normalizing life-destroying interventions. Second, secrecy enables abuse. Ritual confidentiality that shields procedural details from scrutiny also protects the economic gains accrued by those who control knowledge. Third, we should attend to the language bureaucracies use. The flattening of suffering into ledger lines is not incidental. It is an enabling instrument of erasure. And fourth, historical ignorance is not morally neutral. Forgetting victims perpetuates cycles of harm by depriving societies of the memory needed to recognize and resist similar dynamics. How might these lessons be operationalized? For scholars and curators, it means rigorous publication accompanied by interpretive humility and the inclusion of community voices where relevant.
For policymakers and activists, it suggests frameworks for recognizing institutional secrecy as a risk factor for abuse across religious, medical, and social service institutions. For the public, it means resisting simplistic moralizations and instead developing historical literacy that recognizes the complexities of institutional life while still insisting on victims' dignity. We conclude our investigation by returning to the place where we began, the low stone chamber where, in reconstruction, a young woman named Nefertari lay on a cool slab. Reconstructive scenes can feel emotionally raw, and for good reason. They represent individuals who were affected in the most intimate ways. The final minutes of this narrative aim neither to sensationalize nor to settle a contested debate. Instead, they are intended as a ritual of remembrance, a deliberate counterweight to bureaucratic erasure. Imagine the chamber again, but this time through the lens of memory. The temple's lamp rooms have been quiet for thousands of years. The slabs are exposed to modern light now, cataloged and photographed. The objects that once supported ritual reduced to museum labels. In display cases, obsidian blades are identified as lithic tools. Jars bear accession numbers. Those objects are not inert. They are witnesses. They testify to practices of the past that, when read alongside papyri and bones, reveal both care and control. Standing before them, we must choose how to interpret and how to act. There are gestures we can make in the present that honor the past. Museums can provide context-rich labels that do not romanticize ritual. Academic publications can foreground uncertainty and publish primary images. Educational programs can teach how bureaucracies can normalize harm. On an everyday level, all of us can learn to recognize the signs of institutional secrecy and the ways language can domesticate suffering. Remembering the names we can recover, Nefertari, Merit, Hanet Meyer, Mut Maya, is part of that work. Where the names are lost, we can still insist on a memorial of dignity, plaques, moments of silence, or digital memorials that commemorate the individuals whose lives were reduced to ledger entries. At this point in the investigation, we return one final time to the archival imperative: show your sources. In the description accompanying this film, we will publish the papyri citations, the museum accession numbers, and the bibliographic references used in our analysis. Where evidence remains ambiguous, we will mark it indefinito and provide the exact passages so viewers and scholars can weigh the hermeneutic steps for themselves. Transparency is not a bureaucratic afterthought here. It is essential to the moral argument that underpins the entire project. Our last image is quiet. The altar stone sits in a dim room. A conservator's lamp reveals small grooves in the limestone where hands once rested. There is no heroism to the scene, only the sober requirement to remember and to learn. Institutions can be engines of art, culture, and care. They can also be instruments of control. History teaches us both, and the tension between the two is where civic attention must live. If this investigation reached you, if the fragments and reconstructions moved you, please share this video to help center the memory of those whose lives were counted as ledger items.
Tell us where you're watching from in the comments and what revelation here surprised you most. Above all, hold the tension between curiosity and empathy. Let the documents be read, the bones be studied, and the victims be remembered with names, dignity, and the deliberate refusal to let their suffering be reduced to administrative shorthand.